In the quiet suburbs of Philadelphia, David Thompson's world is turned upside down when his teenage son, Ethan, is diagnosed with a rare and devastating autoimmune disease. Faced with mounting medical bills and a healthcare system that seems to have given up on his child, David makes a desperate choice that will test the limits of a father's love and blur the lines between right and wrong. Little does he know that his decision will not only change Ethan's life, but will also uncover a dark underbelly of the medical world, leading him on a heart-pounding journey of hope, betrayal, and unexpected consequences that will leave you questioning just how far you would go to save the one you love. In the heart of suburban Philadelphia, where tree-lined streets met modest homes, lived David Thompson, a 45-year-old former executive whose life had taken an unexpected turn. Once a rising star in the corporate world, David now found himself trapped in a downward spiral of unemployment and mounting debts. His days, once filled with boardroom meetings and high-stakes decisions, were now consumed by an even greater challenge: caring for his teenage son, Ethan, who battled a rare autoimmune disease. As the early morning sun peeked through the worn curtains of their small apartment, David awoke with a familiar knot in his stomach. He glanced at the calendar on his bedside table, each day marked with doctor's appointments and payment due dates. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he forced himself out of bed, his movements heavy with the weight of responsibility. The kitchen, once a place of family gatherings and laughter, now stood as a stark reminder of their financial struggles. David opened the nearly empty refrigerator, its barren shelves mirroring the hollowness he felt inside. He managed to scrape together a meager breakfast for Ethan, a bowl of generic cornflakes and the last of the milk. "Ethan, buddy, time to get up," David called out, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that didn't quite reach his eyes. He heard a weak cough in response, followed by the slow shuffling of feet. Ethan emerged from his room, his thin frame seeming to swim in his oversized pajamas. At 16, he should have been full of life and energy, but his illness had robbed him of the carefree existence most teenagers enjoyed. Dark circles underscored his eyes, a testament to nights spent in pain rather than peaceful slumber. "Morning, Dad," Ethan mumbled, easing himself into a chair at the kitchen table. David watched as his son winced, a small movement that sent a jolt of helplessness through him. He longed to take away Ethan's pain, to shoulder the burden of this cruel disease himself. "How are you feeling today, champ?" David asked, setting the bowl of cereal in front of Ethan. He tried to keep his tone light, but concern seeped through every word. Ethan shrugged, a gesture that spoke volumes. "Same as always, I guess. The new meds aren't really helping much." David nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. The new meds had cost them a fortune. Money they didn't have, borrowed against the hope of a miracle that hadn't materialized. He watched as Ethan picked at his breakfast, each unenthusiastic spoonful a reminder of how much their lives had changed. As Ethan ate, David retreated to the living room, which now doubled as his makeshift office. Stacks of medical bills and past due notices cluttered every surface. He sat down at the computer, a relic from his corporate days, and began his daily ritual of job searching and pleading with creditors. The hours ticked by, each rejection email and stern voicemail from bill collectors chipping away at David's resolve. He had once been respected in his field, known for his quick thinking and problem-solving skills. Now, he felt like a failure, unable to provide for his son when Ethan needed him most. A particularly harsh coughing fit from Ethan's room sent David rushing to his side. He found his son doubled over, gasping for breath, his face contorted in pain. David's heart raced as he rubbed Ethan's back, murmuring words of comfort that felt hollow even to his own ears. "It's okay, buddy. Just breathe. I'm here," David soothed, fighting back his own panic. As the coughing subsided, Ethan leaned back, exhausted. David noticed a faint bluish tinge to his son's lips, a sign that never failed to terrify him. "Dad," Ethan wheezed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I need to go to the hospital." David's mind raced. The last hospital visit had nearly bankrupted them, and he knew they couldn't afford another. But looking at Ethan's pale face, he knew he had no choice. "Okay, son, let's get you dressed. We'll go right away." As he helped Ethan into clean clothes, David's phone buzzed with a new email notification. He glanced at it quickly, his heart sinking as he read the subject line. Urgent. Notice of eviction. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. They were going to lose their home. The one safe haven they had left was about to be taken away. David felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, but he forced it down. He couldn't fall apart now. Ethan needed him. In the car, on the way to the hospital, David gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He glanced at Ethan, slumped in the passenger seat, his breathing labored. The contrast between the bustling streets of Philadelphia and the quiet desperation in their car was stark. As they waited in the emergency room, surrounded by the chaos of urgent cases and worried families, David felt more alone than ever. He watched as nurses and doctors rushed by, wishing desperately for a miracle, for someone to see them and understand their plight. Hours passed in a blur of tests and consultations. David's mind raced, trying to figure out how he would pay for this visit, how he would keep a roof over their heads, how he could possibly continue to provide the care Ethan so desperately needed. As night fell, Ethan was admitted for observation. David sat by his bedside, holding his son's hand, feeling the weight of their uncertain future pressing down on him. He had always prided himself on being able to handle any situation, to find a solution to any problem. But now, faced with the most important challenge of his life, he felt utterly lost. In the quiet of the hospital room, with only the steady beep of monitors for company, David allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. A single tear slid down his cheek as he whispered a desperate prayer to anyone who might be listening. "Please," he murmured, his voice breaking, "I'll do anything. Just help me save my son." Little did David know that his plea would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he believed about right and wrong, about the lengths a parent would go to save their child, and about the true nature of miracles and their costs. As the city lights twinkled outside the hospital window, David Thompson sat vigil over his sleeping son, unaware that his world was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The desperate father was standing on the precipice of a journey that would test his love, his ethics, and his very soul. As the early morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Philadelphia General Hospital, David Thompson trudged wearily towards his car. The past 48 hours had been a blur of beeping monitors, hushed consultations with doctors, and fitful naps in uncomfortable chairs. Ethan's condition had stabilized enough for him to be discharged, but the weight of mounting medical bills and the looming eviction notice hung heavy on David's shoulders. Pulling into the driveway of their modest apartment complex, David's eyes fell on the figure of Dr. Chen, their elderly neighbor, tending to a small garden patch near the entrance. The retired medical researcher, with his silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, had always been friendly, often sharing homegrown vegetables with the Thompsons. As David helped a weak Ethan out of the car, Dr. Chen approached, concern etched on his face. "David, Ethan, is everything all right? I noticed you were gone for a couple of days." David hesitated, not wanting to burden others with his problems, but something in Dr. Chen's gentle demeanor made him open up. "Ethan had another flare-up. We've been at the hospital." Dr. Chen's brow furrowed as he watched Ethan slowly make his way towards the apartment. "The autoimmune condition, yes? It must be very difficult for both of you." David nodded, feeling the exhaustion of the past few days catching up with him. Dr. Chen placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Why don't you both come over for some tea this afternoon? I may have some information that could be of interest to you." Curiosity piqued, David agreed, and later that day, he and Ethan found themselves in Dr. Chen's cozy living room. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with medical texts and research papers. As they sipped on aromatic green tea, Dr. Chen began to speak. "During my years of research, I worked on several experimental treatments for rare autoimmune disorders," he explained, his eyes lighting up with the passion of a lifelong scientist. "One particular study showed incredible promise, but funding was cut before we could complete the trials. David leaned forward, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. "Are you saying there might be a treatment for Ethan's condition?" Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "Potentially, yes. The preliminary results were quite remarkable. However," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "the treatment is still in its experimental stages and hasn't received official approval." Ethan, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "But if it could help, isn't it worth trying?" Dr. Chen smiled kindly at the teenager. "It's not that simple, young man. There are risks involved with any experimental treatment." David's mind was racing. On one hand, the idea of an untested treatment terrified him. On the other, seeing Ethan suffer day after day, knowing that conventional medicine was failing him, made him desperate for any glimmer of hope. As if sensing David's internal struggle, Dr. Chen continued, "I understand this is a lot to take in, but there's something else I wanted to discuss with you, David." He reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope. "I couldn't help but overhear your phone conversation the other day about financial difficulties. I want to help." David felt a mix of shame and gratitude wash over him as Dr. Chen slid the envelope across the coffee table. "I don't know what to say," he stammered, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. "You don't have to say anything," Dr. Chen replied warmly. "Consider it an investment in Ethan's future. And perhaps, if you're interested, we could discuss the possibility of trying the experimental treatment." As they left Dr. Chen's apartment, David's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The envelope in his pocket felt both like a lifeline and a burden. The prospect of a new treatment for Ethan filled him with cautious optimism, but the risks involved made his stomach churn. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, David sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope and a brochure Dr. Chen had given him about the experimental treatment. The rational part of his brain urged caution, reminding him of the potential dangers of untested medical procedures. But as he heard Ethan's labored breathing from the other room, the voice of desperation grew louder. Days passed, and Ethan's condition continued to deteriorate. Each coughing fit, each wince of pain, chipped away at David's resolve. He found himself spending more time with Dr. Chen, poring over research papers and medical journals, clinging to the hope that this unorthodox treatment might be the miracle they so desperately needed. It was a particularly bad night when David finally made his decision. Ethan's fever had spiked dangerously high, and as David held his son's trembling body, he knew he had to take the risk. The next morning, with hands shaking, he called Dr. Chen. "We'll do it," David said, his voice a mixture of determination and fear. "We'll try the treatment." Dr. Chen's response was measured, but David could hear the excitement underneath. "I understand, David. We'll start preparations immediately. But remember, this must be kept confidential. The implications of unauthorized treatment could be severe." As he hung up the phone, David felt as if he had just stepped off a cliff, unsure if he would fly or fall. He went to Ethan's room, where his son lay pale and weak against his pillows. "Hey, buddy," David said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "How would you feel about trying something new? Something that might help you feel better?" Ethan's eyes, dulled by pain and fatigue, sparked with a glimmer of hope. "Really? You mean Dr. Chen's treatment?" David nodded, forcing a smile. "That's right. But I need you to understand that it's not guaranteed to work, and there might be risks." Ethan reached out and grabbed his father's hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. "I trust you, Dad, and I'm tired of feeling this way. Let's do it." As David embraced his son, a mix of love, hope, and fear swirled in his heart. He silently prayed that he was making the right decision, unaware of the profound consequences this choice would have on their lives. In the coming days, as they began the clandestine treatments under Dr. Chen's guidance, David couldn't shake the feeling that he had set foot on a path from which there was no turning back. Little did he know that this decision, born of desperation and love, would lead them into a web of secrets, ethical dilemmas, and unforeseen dangers that would test the limits of their resilience and the strength of their bond. The soft hum of medical equipment filled the makeshift treatment room in Dr. Chen's basement. David Thompson sat anxiously, his eyes fixed on Ethan as the mysterious experimental treatment flowed into his son's veins. Dr. Chun moved about with practiced efficiency, checking monitors and adjusting dosages. "How are you feeling, Ethan?" Dr. Chun asked, his voice calm and reassuring. Ethan, pale but alert, managed a weak smile. "Okay, I guess. A little dizzy, but not bad." David's heart raced. Every fiber of his being hoped this risk would pay off, that this unconventional path would lead to the miracle they so desperately needed. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, David held his breath, watching for any sign of improvement or, worse, deterioration in Ethan's condition. At first, the changes were subtle. Ethan's appetite improved slightly. His sleep became more restful. But as the treatment continued, the transformation became undeniable. One crisp Saturday morning, about a month into the treatment, David was jolted awake by an unfamiliar sound: laughter. He rushed out of his room to find Ethan in the kitchen, attempting to make pancakes, a mess of flour and batter surrounding him. "Dad!" Ethan exclaimed, his eyes bright with an energy David hadn't seen in years. "I woke up starving, so I thought I'd surprise you with breakfast." David stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sight of his son, cheeks flushed with health, movements strong and sure. It was as if the illness that had plagued Ethan for so long had simply vanished overnight. "Ethan, this is incredible," David stammered, fighting back tears of joy. The improvements continued at an astonishing rate. Ethan's medical checkups showed a dramatic reduction in inflammation markers. His energy levels soared, and for the first time in years, he began talking about returning to school, joining sports teams, living a normal teenage life. As Ethan's health flourished, so did David's prospects. With the weight of constant caregiving lifted, David threw himself into his job search with renewed vigor. His network, long neglected due to Ethan's illness, began to yield results. One sunny afternoon, as David sat in a local cafe preparing for a job interview, his phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Guess what, Dad? I just ran a mile without stopping." David's heart swelled with pride and gratitude. He looked up from his phone to see his reflection in the cafe window. Gone were the dark circles under his eyes and the worried frown that had become a permanent fixture. He looked happy. The job interview went better than David could have hoped. His experience, combined with his newfound energy and optimism, impressed the panel. By the end of the week, he had an offer for a position that not only utilized his skills, but also offered the flexibility he needed to continue overseeing Ethan's care. Life began to take on a rhythm that felt almost normal. David threw himself into his new job, relishing the intellectual challenges and the ability to contribute meaningfully again. Ethan returned to school, quickly catching up on missed work and even joining the track team. Dr. Chun continued to monitor Ethan's progress closely, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction at each positive report. "The results are beyond my most optimistic projections," he told David during one of their now routine check-ins. However, as weeks turned into months, a nagging worry began to gnaw at the edges of David's consciousness. The treatment's effects seemed almost too good to be true. He found himself watching Ethan closely, looking for any sign that this miracle might be temporary. It was a warm evening in late spring when David's fears began to materialize. He and Ethan were enjoying a game of catch in their small backyard, something that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Suddenly, Ethan missed an easy catch, the ball sailing past his outstretched hands. "You okay, buddy?" David called out, noticing a slight tremor in Ethan's hands. Ethan flexed his fingers, a look of confusion crossing his face. "Yeah, my hand feels a bit weird, probably just tired from practice." David tried to brush it off, but over the next few days, he noticed other small changes. Ethan seemed to tire more easily, and there was a slight tremor in his hands that hadn't been there before. At first, David convinced himself it was just the result of Ethan pushing himself too hard, eager to make up for lost time. But then came the night that shattered their fragile sense of normalcy. David was awakened by a crash from Ethan's room. He rushed in to find his son on the floor, disoriented and confused. "Dad!" Ethan's voice was slurred, his eyes struggling to focus. I don't feel right." Panic gripped David as he helped Ethan back to bed. The tremors were more pronounced now, and Ethan's skin felt clammy to the touch. As he reached for his phone to call Dr. Chun, David's mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Dr. Chun arrived quickly, his usual calm demeanor tinged with concern as he examined Ethan. "It could be a temporary setback," he murmured, more to himself than to David. "We may need to adjust the treatment." But as David watched Dr. Chun work, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were venturing into uncharted territory. The miraculous recovery that had seemed like a gift from the heavens now felt like a ticking time bomb. As the night wore on and Ethan finally fell into a fitful sleep, David stood by the window, staring out at the quiet street. The joy and relief of the past few months now felt like a distant memory. He realized with a sinking heart that their journey was far from over. In fact, it might have only just begun. In the pale light of dawn, as he watched Ethan's restless sleep, David was hit with a chilling realization. In his desperate quest to save his son, had he unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that could lead to an even worse fate? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, and for the first time since starting this risky treatment, David allowed himself to wonder, "What have I done?" Little did David know that this night was just the beginning of a harrowing journey that would test not only Ethan's resilience, but also the limits of David's love, ethics, and determination. As the first rays of sunlight crept into the room, father and son stood on the precipice of a challenge that would shake their world to its very core. The once bustling Thompson household had fallen into an uneasy quiet. Gone were the sounds of Ethan's laughter and the energetic footsteps that had filled the home just weeks ago. Instead, a palpable tension hung in the air as David watched his son's condition deteriorate with alarming speed. It started with small things, a tremor here, a moment of confusion there. But as days passed, the side effects of Dr. Chen's experimental treatment grew increasingly severe and bizarre. Ethan's usually warm brown eyes now held a glassy, distant look, and his skin had taken on an unsettling pallor with occasional patches of discoloration. One morning, as David helped Ethan get ready for a checkup with Dr. Chun, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. "Ethan," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "can you look at me for a second?" Ethan turned, his movements sluggish. David's breath caught in his throat. Ethan's left eye had changed color overnight, shifting from brown to an unnatural, almost luminescent green. "What's wrong, Dad?" Ethan asked, his words slightly slurred. David forced a smile. "Nothing, buddy. Let's just get you to Dr. Chun. Okay?" The drive to Dr. Chen's makeshift clinic was tense. David's mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. He glanced at Ethan, who sat silently in the passenger seat, occasionally twitching or mumbling incoherently. Dr. Chen's usual calm demeanor faltered when he saw Ethan's condition. He ushered them quickly into his examination room, his brow furrowed with concern. "How long has his eye been like this?" Dr. Chun asked, shining a light into Ethan's mismatched eyes. "I just noticed it this morning," David replied, his voice tight with worry. "But he's been having other symptoms too. The tremors are getting worse, and sometimes he seems not himself." Dr. Chun nodded gravely, jotting notes on his pad. "I've seen similar side effects in some of my other patients," he admitted, "but nothing quite this severe." David's head snapped up. "Other patients? I thought Ethan was the only one receiving this treatment." Dr. Chun hesitated, realizing his slip. "Well, yes, there are a few others, all with similarly rare conditions that traditional medicine couldn't help." A mix of emotions washed over David's: shock, betrayal, and a growing sense of dread. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Are they experiencing the same side effects?" Dr. Chun sighed, removing his glasses to rub his tired eyes. "Some are, yes. But David, you have to understand, this treatment is still highly experimental. We're in uncharted territory here." As they discussed potential modifications to Ethan's treatment plan, David couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. The risks suddenly seemed to outweigh the benefits, but the thought of stopping the treatment and watching Ethan regress to his previous state was unbearable. Over the next few weeks, David found himself in a constant state of vigilance. He took time off work, using up his newly acquired vacation days to monitor Ethan around the clock. The changes in his son's behavior became increasingly alarming. One afternoon, David found Ethan in the kitchen, staring blankly at the wall. When he approached, Ethan turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, Dad," Ethan said, his voice unnaturally cheerful. "I was just thinking about how great it would be if we could breathe underwater. Wouldn't that be cool?" David felt a chill run down his spine. "Sure, buddy. That would be interesting." As he guided Ethan back to his room, David's mind raced. These moments of bizarre thoughts and behavior were becoming more frequent, interspersed with periods of lethargy and confusion. Determined to get answers, David began to do his own research. Late at night, after Ethan had fallen into his now fitful sleep, David scoured medical journals and online forums, looking for any information on experimental treatments for autoimmune disorders. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that David stumbled upon a news article that made his heart skip a beat. The headline read, "Controversial researcher linked to unethical medical trials." As David read further, his sense of unease grew. The article mentioned a series of experimental treatments conducted outside of official channels, with patients experiencing severe, unexplained side effects. While no names were mentioned, the description of the treatments and their effects bore a chilling similarity to Ethan's situation. With trembling hands, David reached for his phone and dialed Dr. Chen's number. It was late, but this couldn't wait. "Dr. Chen," David said as soon as the call connected, not bothering with pleasantries. "I need to know everything about this treatment. Where did it come from? Who developed it? And what aren't you telling me about the other patients?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Dr. Chen finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "David, I understand your concerns, but I assure you, everything I've done has been in the best interest of Ethan and the others." "That's not good enough," David pressed, his voice rising. "I need answers, real answers. No more evasions." Dr. Chen sighed. "Very well. Come to my office tomorrow morning. I'll tell you everything." As David hung up the phone, he felt a mix of determination and fear. He glanced at Ethan's closed bedroom door, listening to the sound of his son's restless movements. Whatever the truth was, David knew he had to face it for Ethan's sake. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, matching David's mood as he prepared for his meeting with Dr. Chen. As he was about to leave, Ethan emerged from his room, looking more lucid than he had in days. "Dad," Ethan called out, his voice small and uncertain. "Something's wrong with me, isn't it?" David felt his heart breaking as he looked at his son. The mismatched eyes, the trembling hands, the fear etched across his young face. He pulled Ethan into a tight embrace. "I'm going to figure this out, buddy," David promised, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever it takes, I'm going to make this right." As he drove to Dr. Chen's office, David steeled himself for whatever revelations awaited him. He didn't know what he would discover, but he was certain of one thing: he would stop at nothing to save his son, no matter the cost. Little did David know that the truths he was about to uncover would shake his world to its core, setting in motion a chain of events that would test the limits of his love, his ethics, and his very sanity. The desperate father was about to step into a world of shadows and secrets, where the line between right and wrong blurred, and where the price of a miracle might be higher than he could ever have imagined. The morning air felt heavy as David pulled into the parking lot of Dr. Chen's clinic. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. The weight of Ethan's deteriorating condition and the looming confrontation with Dr. Chen pressed down on him like a physical force. As David entered the clinic, he noticed an unusual stillness. The receptionist's desk was empty, and the waiting room eerily quiet. He made his way down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Dr. Chen's office door was ajar. David paused, taking a deep breath to steel himself before pushing it open. The sight that greeted him was unexpected. Dr. Chun sat behind his desk, looking older and more haggard than David had ever seen him. Stacks of files and research papers covered every surface, giving the room a chaotic, almost frantic atmosphere. "David," Dr. Chun said, his voice weary, "please sit down." As David took a seat, he noticed a framed photograph on the desk. It showed a younger Dr. Chun standing proudly in a state-of-the-art laboratory, surrounded by a team of researchers. The contrast between that image and the tired man before him was stark. "I owe you an explanation," Dr. Chun began, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. "The treatment Ethan has been receiving, it's not just experimental. It's controversial." David leaned forward, his jaw clenched. "What do you mean, controversial?" Dr. Chun sighed heavily. "Years ago, I was part of a cutting-edge research team at Meridian Pharmaceuticals. We were on the verge of a breakthrough in treating autoimmune disorders. But our methods, they pushed ethical boundaries." As Dr. Chun spoke, David felt a growing sense of dread. The doctor described a series of trials that had shown incredible promise but had also resulted in severe, unexpected side effects in some patients. "The pharmaceutical company wanted to bury the research," Dr. Chun continued, his voice tinged with bitterness. "They were afraid of lawsuits, bad publicity, but I couldn't let it go. I knew we were onto something that could help people like Ethan." David's mind raced, connecting the dots. "So you continued the research on your own? Without approval?" Dr. Chun nodded slowly. "I couldn't abandon those who had no other hope. But working outside the system, it's been challenging. Limited resources, no oversight. And the other patients?" David pressed, remembering the article he had read. Dr. Chen's shoulders slumped. "There have been complications. Some have shown remarkable improvement like Ethan initially did. Others..." He trailed off, but David could fill in the blanks. His stomach churned as he thought of Ethan's worsening condition. "Why didn't you tell me all this from the beginning?" David demanded, anger rising in his voice. "Would you have agreed to the treatment if you knew?" Dr. Chun countered, "I've seen Ethan's suffering. I truly believed this was his best chance." David stood up abruptly, pacing the small office. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, fear, betrayal, and underneath it all, a gnawing guilt. Had his desperation to help Ethan blinded him to the risks? "What about the authorities?" David asked suddenly. "Surely someone must be investigating this?" Dr. Chen's expression darkened. "There have been inquiries, but I'm not the only one involved in this, David. There are powerful people who have a vested interest in keeping this research going outside of official channels." The implication hung heavy in the air. David realized he had stumbled into something far larger and more complex than he had imagined. "So what now?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What about Ethan?" Dr. Chun leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I'm close to a breakthrough, David. If I can just refine the treatment, adjust the dosage, I believe we can mitigate the side effects and harness the full potential of this therapy." David felt torn. On one hand, the rational part of his brain screamed at him to get Ethan as far away from this unauthorized experiment as possible. On the other, the desperate father in him clung to the hope of a cure. "I need time to think," David said finally, his voice hoarse. "And I need all your research, every bit of data you have on this treatment and its effects." Dr. Chun nodded, reaching for a thick folder on his desk. "This contains everything. But David, be careful. There are people who would go to great lengths to keep this information from getting out." As David left the clinic, the folder clutched tightly to his chest. He felt as if he had stepped into a different world. The sunlight seemed too bright, the everyday sounds of the city surreal against the weight of what he had just learned. Driving home, his mind raced with possibilities and fears. He knew he should go straight to the authorities, expose the whole operation. But what would that mean for Ethan? For the other patients who might be benefiting from the treatment? As he pulled into his driveway, David made a decision. He couldn't trust Dr. Chun completely, but he couldn't dismiss the possibility of a cure either. He would dive into the research himself, try to understand what was happening to Ethan, and find a way to help him without crossing ethical lines. Little did David know that this decision would plunge him into a world of clandestine medical research, corporate cover-ups, and moral dilemmas that would test the very core of his beliefs. As he walked into his house, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, David Thompson had no idea that he was about to become a key player in a dangerous game where the stakes were not just Ethan's life, but the future of medical science itself. The path ahead was fraught with peril, but for his son, David was willing to risk everything. The battle for Ethan's life and for the truth had only just begun. The soft glow of David's laptop screen illuminated his haggard face as he pored over Dr. Chen's research files late into the night. Empty coffee cups littered the kitchen table, testament to his relentless pursuit of answers. For days, he had immersed himself in complex medical jargon and experimental data, desperate to understand the treatment that was both miracle and menace to his son. As David delved deeper into the research, the enormity of the ethical quandary before him became painfully clear. The treatment showed incredible promise not just for Ethan, but for countless others suffering from autoimmune disorders. Yet the risks were undeniable, with some test subjects experiencing severe, life-altering side effects. A sudden coughing fit from Ethan's room snapped David out of his research-induced trance. He rushed to his son's side, heart pounding. Ethan was curled up in bed, his mismatched eyes wide with fear as tremors racked his body. "Dad," Ethan gasped between coughs. "What's happening to me?" David held his son close, feeling utterly helpless. "We're figuring it out, buddy. I promise we'll make this better." As Ethan's fit subsided and he drifted back to sleep, David returned to the kitchen, his resolve strengthened. He couldn't continue this treatment blindly, but the thought of stopping it and watching Ethan regress to his previous state was unbearable. The next morning, fueled by determination and too much caffeine, David reached out to Dr. Sarah Lindholm, a renowned immunologist he discovered during his research. Her work on ethical medical trials had caught his attention, and he hoped she might provide an unbiased second opinion. To his surprise, Dr. Lindholm agreed to meet him that afternoon. As David entered her office at the University Medical Center, he was struck by the contrast between her pristine, official workspace and Dr. Chen's cluttered, secretive clinic. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Lindholm greeted him, her piercing blue eyes studying him intently. "I've reviewed the files you sent over. I must say this is highly irregular." David nodded, his throat tight. "I know, but my son, he's running out of options." Dr. Lindholm's expression softened slightly. "I understand your desperation, Mr. Thompson, but this treatment, it's not just experimental, it's dangerous. The long-term effects are unknown, and some of these side effects could be irreversible." Her words hit David like a physical blow. "But if we stop the treatment now, it could be equally dangerous," Dr. Lindholm finished for him. "Abrupt cessation of this kind of therapy could trigger a severe autoimmune response. Your son's condition could rapidly deteriorate." David slumped in his chair, the weight of the impossible decision crushing down on him. "So what do I do? Continue a treatment that might be killing him, or stop it and watch him suffer?" Dr. Lindholm leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Thompson, I cannot in good conscience recommend continuing this unauthorized treatment. However, I believe we might be able to develop a protocol to safely wean Ethan off it while managing his symptoms." A glimmer of hope sparked in David's chest. "You'd be willing to help? Under official channels, yes?" Dr. Lindholm nodded. "We'd need to report this to the proper authorities. Get approval for a specialized treatment plan. It won't be easy, and it will take time, but it's the safest path forward." As David left Dr. Lindholm's office, his mind was a battleground of conflicting emotions. The rational part of him knew she was right. Continuing the unauthorized treatment was a dangerous gamble. But the desperate father in him clung to the memory of Ethan's brief period of health, the joy in his son's eyes when he could run and play like a normal teenager. That evening, as David sat by Ethan's bedside, watching his son's fitful sleep, the full weight of his dilemma crashed down upon him. Tears streamed down his face as he grappled with the impossible choice before him. "What's the right thing to do, buddy?" he whispered to his sleeping son. "How do I protect you without giving up on you?" As if in response, Ethan stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For a brief moment, lucidity returned to his gaze. "Dad," he said, his voice weak but clear, "I trust you. Whatever you decide, I know you're doing it because you love me." David's heart swelled with a mixture of love and anguish. In that moment, he realized that no matter what path he chose, the road ahead would be fraught with challenges and uncertainties. As dawn broke, casting a soft light through Ethan's bedroom window, David made his decision. He would work with Dr. Lindholm to develop a safe withdrawal plan, but he wouldn't completely abandon Dr. Chen's research. There had to be a way to harness the treatment's potential while mitigating its risks. With trembling hands, he reached for his phone to call Dr. Chen. As he dialed the number, David knew he was walking a tightrope between hope and danger, between ethical medical practice and desperate measures. But for Ethan, he was willing to navigate this treacherous path. Little did David know that his decision would set in motion a chain of events that would not only challenge his own moral compass but also attract the attention of powerful forces with their own agendas. As he prepared to face the day ahead, David Thompson stood at the crossroads of a journey that would test the limits of his love, his ethics, and his determination to save his son at any cost. The battle for Ethan's life was entering a new phase, one that would push David to his limits and force him to confront the true cost of a parent's love in the face of an unforgiving medical system. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor buzzed overhead as David paced back and forth, his mind racing. It had been a week since he'd begun working with Dr. Lindholm to wean Ethan off Dr. Chen's experimental treatment. The process was agonizingly slow, each day a delicate balancing act between managing Ethan's symptoms and navigating the dangerous waters of withdrawal. As he waited for Dr. Lindholm to finish her latest examination of Ethan, David's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Parking garage, level B2, 30 minutes. Come alone." David's heart raced. He'd been doing his own investigating, reaching out to online forums and support groups for families dealing with rare autoimmune disorders. He dropped hints, asked carefully worded questions, hoping to uncover more about the network Dr. Chen had alluded to. Was this a response to his probing? Against his better judgment, David decided to go. He left a note for Dr. Lindholm, claiming he needed to run an errand, and headed for the parking garage. The lower levels of the garage were dimly lit and eerily quiet. As David reached B2, he saw a figure standing in the shadows near a concrete pillar. His hand tightened around the pepper spray in his pocket as he approached. "Mr. Thompson." The figure spoke, stepping into the light. It was a woman, probably in her early 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "I'm Dr. Evelyn Reeves. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance in Dr. Chen." David's suspicion mixed with curiosity. "How do you know Dr. Chen? Are you part of his research network?" Dr. Reeves' lips tightened into a thin line. "It's more complicated than that. There's a lot you don't know about the treatment your son is receiving. A lot that Chen himself doesn't fully understand." Over the next half hour, Dr. Reeves painted a picture that left David reeling. The experimental treatment wasn't just the work of a rogue researcher, it was part of a vast underground network of doctors, researchers, and even some pharmaceutical executives working outside the boundaries of traditional medicine. "We're not criminals, Mr. Thompson," Dr. Reeves insisted, her eyes flashing. "We're trying to help people that the system has failed. But our methods, they don't always align with official protocols." David's mind raced, trying to process this new information. "But the risks, the side effects Ethan is experiencing," Dr. Reeves nodded gravely. "That's why I reached out. We're close to a breakthrough that could stabilize the treatment, eliminate the worst side effects. But we need more data, more patience." The implication hung heavy in the air. They wanted to use Ethan as a test subject. "Absolutely not," David said firmly, taking a step back. "I'm working with Dr. Lindholm to get Ethan off this treatment safely. I won't risk his life on more unauthorized experiments." Dr. Reeves' expression hardened. "Mr. Thompson, you don't understand the forces at play here. There are powerful people invested in this research. People who won't take kindly to it being exposed." The threat was thinly veiled, and David felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm warning you," Dr. Reeves corrected. "For your sake and Ethan's. Be careful who you trust." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving David alone in the dim garage, his mind whirling with questions and fears. Determined to uncover the truth, David spent the next few days diving deeper into his investigation. He created an anonymous online profile, reaching out to others who hinted at knowledge of the underground medical network. Slowly, he began to piece together a disturbing picture. Late one night, as Ethan slept fitfully in the next room, David found himself on a secure chat room, communicating with others who claimed to be part of the network. The conversation moved quickly, with references to clinical trials, experimental drugs, and mysterious benefactors. Just as David felt he was getting close to some real answers, a private message popped up on his screen. "Meeting tomorrow, 8 p.m., Old Pharmacy on 5th and Main. Password, Prometheus." David's heart pounded. This was it, a chance to infiltrate the network and uncover the truth. But the risks were enormous. What if it was a trap? As dawn broke, David made his decision. He would go to the meeting, but not before taking precautions. He reached out to a journalist friend, sharing everything he discovered and arranging for them to be his safety net. The next evening, David found himself standing in front of a dilapidated building that once housed a pharmacy. His palms were sweaty as he knocked on the door and whispered, "Prometheus." The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with people. Some wore lab coats, others expensive suits. In the center of the room stood a familiar face, Dr. Chun, looking both surprised and alarmed to see David. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Chun said, his voice strained, "I don't think you should be here." But it was too late. David was already scanning the room, recognizing faces he'd seen in medical journals and on the news. Prominent doctors, researchers, even a senator known for his work on healthcare reform. As the meeting began, David listened in growing horror as the group discussed ongoing trials, potential test subjects, and ways to avoid regulatory oversight. It was clear that this network reached far beyond what he had imagined, involving not just desperate researchers like Dr. Chun, but powerful figures with their own agendas. Just as David was considering how to make his exit, a commotion erupted near the door. "We've been compromised," someone shouted. "There's a journalist outside." In the chaos that followed, David locked eyes with Dr. Chun. The old doctor's face was a mask of regret and fear. "Run, David," he mouthed silently. Heart pounding, David slipped out a back door into the alley behind the building. As he ran, he could hear shouts and footsteps behind him. He had uncovered a truth far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And now he was a threat to powerful people with everything to lose. As David raced through the dark streets, his mind was focused on one thing: getting back to Ethan. He had stumbled into a world of shadows and secrets, and he knew that his fight to save his son had just become infinitely more complicated and dangerous. The quiet, desperate father was now a man on the run, carrying secrets that could topple careers and change the face of medicine. But more importantly, he held the key to saving not just Ethan, but potentially countless others trapped in the web of this clandestine medical underworld. As sirens wailed in the distance, David Thompson realized that his journey had only just begun, and the true battle for his son's life and for the truth lay ahead. The pre-dawn light cast long shadows as David Thompson crept into his own home, heart pounding. After narrowly escaping the clandestine meeting, he'd spent hours evading potential pursuers, his mind reeling from the revelations of the night. As he entered Ethan's room, the sight of his son's pale, restless form reignited the urgency of his mission. Ethan stirred, his mismatched eyes flickering open. "Dad?" he mumbled, voice weak. "What's going on?" David forced a reassuring smile. "Everything's okay, buddy. We're just going on a little trip." As he helped Ethan pack a small bag, David's phone buzzed. It was a text from his journalist friend. "Sam, they're coming." Get out now." With trembling hands, David scooped up Ethan's medical records and Dr. Chen's research files. They slipped out the back door just as the sound of screeching tires filled the pre-dawn quiet. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked as David sped down back streets, constantly checking the rearview mirror. "To see a friend," David replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Someone who can help us." That someone was Dr. Sarah Lindholm. Despite the early hour, she answered David's frantic call and agreed to meet them at a small, private clinic on the outskirts of the city. As they waited in Dr. Lindholm's office, David filled her in on the events of the past 24 hours. Her expression grew increasingly grave as he spoke. "This is far bigger than I imagined," she said, poring over the files David had brought. "The implications of this research, it could revolutionize treatment for autoimmune disorders. But the risks, the ethical violations." She shook her head, looking troubled. A fit of violent coughing from Ethan interrupted their conversation. Dr. Lindholm rushed to examine him, her brow furrowing with concern. "His condition is deteriorating rapidly," she said, her voice tight. "The abrupt change in his treatment regimen combined with the stress. We need to stabilize him fast." The next few hours were a blur of medical tests, hushed consultations, and mounting anxiety. Dr. Lindholm worked tirelessly, drawing on her extensive knowledge and network of ethical colleagues to devise a treatment plan for Ethan. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, David's phone buzzed again. It was Sam. "Stories going live in an hour. Be prepared for fallout." David showed the message to Dr. Lindholm, whose eyes widened. "Once this breaks, we'll have very little time," she said. "The authorities will be all over this, and those involved in the underground network will be desperate to cover their tracks." "So what do we do?" David asked, feeling helpless. Dr. Lindholm's jaw set with determination. "We do what ethical doctors are supposed to do. We focus on saving our patient." Over the next several hours, David watched in awe as Dr. Lindholm coordinated a team of specialists, each bringing their expertise to bear on Ethan's complex case. They worked to counteract the negative effects of the experimental treatment while trying to preserve the positive outcomes. As afternoon faded into evening, David's phone exploded with notifications. Sam's story had broken, exposing the underground medical network and sending shockwaves through the medical community. David caught glimpses of familiar names: Dr. Chun, Dr. Reeves, even some of the high-profile figures he'd seen at the secret meeting, all now at the center of a growing scandal. But David had no time to dwell on the unfolding drama. Ethan's condition had reached a critical point. His body, caught between the experimental treatment and the attempts to wean him off it, was in crisis. "We need to make a decision," Dr. Lindholm said, her voice grave. "We can continue trying to eliminate the experimental treatment from his system, but in his weakened state, that could be fatal. Or what?" David pressed, desperate for any option. Dr. Lindholm took a deep breath. "Or we can try to synthesize a stabilized version of the treatment, using what we've learned from Dr. Chen's research and our own analysis. It's risky, and it's still experimental, but it might be Ethan's best chance." David felt the weight of the decision crushing down on him. He looked at Ethan, pale and struggling for breath on the hospital bed, then back at Dr. Lindholm's determined face. "Do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever it takes to save him." What followed was a race against time. Dr. Lindholm and her team worked around the clock, synthesizing the new treatment while monitoring Ethan's failing health. David stayed by his son's side, holding his hand, whispering words of encouragement, and praying for a miracle. Outside, the world was in chaos. News vans crowded the hospital parking lot, reporters clamoring for information about the breaking medical scandal. David caught snippets of updates, arrests being made, investigations launched, careers and reputations crumbling. But none of that mattered to David. His entire world had narrowed to the beeping monitors, the hushed conversations of doctors, and the weak pulse beneath his fingers as he clutched Ethan's hand. As dawn broke on the third day, Dr. Lindholm entered the room, her face etched with exhaustion but her eyes bright with cautious hope. "It's ready," she said. "Are you sure you want to proceed?" David looked at Ethan, then back at Dr. Lindholm. In that moment, he knew that whatever happened, they had done everything they could. They had fought against time, against an unethical system, against the very limits of medical science. "Yes," David said, his voice strong despite his fear. "Let's do it." As the new treatment began to flow into Ethan's veins, David Thompson held his breath, hoping against hope that this desperate gamble would pay off. In the growing light of a new day, father and son stood on the precipice of either a miraculous recovery or a devastating loss. The next few hours would determine not just Ethan's fate, but potentially the future of medical treatment for countless others. The race against time had reached its final, crucial moments, and all David could do now was wait, hope, and hold on to his son's hand as if his own life depended on it. The rhythmic beeping of medical monitors filled the tense silence of Ethan's hospital room. David Thompson sat vigil by his son's bedside, his eyes never leaving Ethan's pale face as the synthesized treatment flowed into his veins. Dr. Lindholm hovered nearby, constantly checking vitals and making minute adjustments to the treatment protocol. Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, changes began to occur. Ethan's breathing became less labored. His skin tone improved slightly. The erratic spikes on the heart monitor began to stabilize. "It's working," Dr. Lindholm whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and cautious optimism. "His body isn't rejecting it." David felt a surge of hope, but he didn't dare celebrate yet. They had been down this road before with Dr. Chen's original treatment. He knew all too well how quickly things could take a turn for the worse. As morning light began to filter through the hospital blinds, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. Raised voices and hurried footsteps approached Ethan's room. Suddenly, the door burst open, revealing a group of stern-faced individuals in suits, led by none other than Dr. Evelyn Reeves. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Reeves said, her voice cold, "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the patient. This treatment must be discontinued immediately." David rose to his feet, positioning himself protectively between the intruders and Ethan's bed. "Who are you people? You can't just barge in here and—" "I'm Agent Carlson, FDA," one of the suited individuals interrupted, flashing a badge. "We have orders to shut down all treatments related to the illegal medical network you've been involved with." Dr. Lindholm stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "This treatment is not part of that network. It's a legally synthesized, emergency protocol based on ethical research." Dr. Reeves scoffed. "Based on stolen research, you mean? Research that belongs to our organization." "Your organization?" David's voice rose in anger. "You mean the group that's been experimenting on desperate patients without any oversight or ethics?" Agent Carlson held up a hand. "Mr. Thompson, you're in a very precarious legal position right now. I suggest you cooperate." The standoff was interrupted by a weak voice from the bed. "Dad!" All eyes turned to Ethan, who was stirring, his eyes fluttering open. For the first time in weeks, his gaze was clear and focused. David rushed to his son's side. "I'm here, buddy. How do you feel?" Ethan managed a small smile. "Better. Like the fog is lifting." Dr. Lindholm quickly moved to examine Ethan, her expression shifting from concern to amazement. "This is remarkable. His vitals are stabilizing, inflammation markers are down." Dr. Reeves pushed forward, her composure cracking. "This is impossible. Our research indicated that a stable version of the treatment was years away from—" "Your research was flawed," Dr. Lindholm interrupted sharply. "Flawed because it prioritized speed and profit over patient safety and ethical considerations. What we've done here proves that with proper protocols and oversight, this treatment has real potential." Agent Carlson looked conflicted, glancing between Ethan's improving condition and his team. "We still have orders to—" "To what?" David challenged, finding a strength he didn't know he had. "To deny a dying child a treatment that's clearly working? To protect the interests of an organization that's been operating outside the law." The room fell silent, the weight of the moment palpable. It was Dr. Lindholm who finally broke the tension. "I propose a compromise," she said, addressing Agent Carlson. "Allow us to continue Ethan's treatment under strict FDA oversight. Use this as a case study for how this research can be applied ethically and effectively." Agent Carlson considered for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll have to make some calls, but given the circumstances, I think we can arrange that." Dr. Reeves started to protest, but Agent Carlson silenced her with a look. "Dr. Reeves, I think you and I need to have a long conversation about your involvement in all this." As Dr. Reeves and most of the agents were led away, David felt a wave of relief wash over him. He turned back to Ethan, who was looking stronger by the minute. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice tired but clear, "is it over? Are we going to be okay?" David smiled, tears welling in his eyes as he squeezed his son's hand. "Yeah, buddy, I think we are." Over the next few hours, the hospital room became a flurry of activity. FDA officials, ethical review boards, and medical experts cycled through, all amazed by Ethan's rapid improvement and the potential of the new treatment. Dr. Lindholm worked tirelessly, explaining the process, sharing data, and advocating for continued research under proper guidelines. David watched in awe as the doctor he had once seen as an adversary became the champion for a new era of ethical medical advancement. As evening fell, the chaos finally began to subside. Ethan had drifted off into a peaceful sleep, his breathing easy and unlabored for the first time in months. David stood by the window, looking out at the city lights, reflecting on the incredible journey they had been through. Dr. Lindholm joined him, her face showing the fatigue of the long day but also a sense of accomplishment. "You know," she said softly, "what you and Ethan have been through, what you've helped uncover, it's going to change things. A lot of people who had given up hope might now have a chance." David nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions. "I just wanted to save my son," he said. "I never imagined it would lead to all this." "That's often how the biggest changes start," Dr. Lindholm replied, "with one person refusing to give up, refusing to accept that nothing can be done." As they stood there, watching over Ethan's sleeping form, David felt a sense of peace settling over him. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be investigations, possibly trials, and certainly a long journey of recovery for Ethan. But for the first time in a long time, David felt hope, not just for his son, but for all the other families out there facing similar battles. He had set out to save Ethan, but in the process, he had helped expose a broken system and pave the way for ethical advancements that could save countless lives. As the night deepened and the city settled into a quiet hum, David Thompson realized that sometimes, the greatest acts of love can have repercussions far beyond what we ever imagine. The battle was over, but the impact of their journey was only beginning to unfold. 6 months had passed since that fateful night in the hospital room. The warm summer sun streamed through the windows of the Thompson home, casting a golden glow on Ethan as he sat at the kitchen table, poring over his textbooks. David paused in the doorway, marveling at the sight of his son, healthy, vibrant, and fully engaged in the normal struggles of teenage life. "Hey, Dad," Ethan said, looking up with a smile. "Can you quiz me on this biology stuff? I've got a big test tomorrow." David chuckled, sitting down across from his son. "Sure thing, buddy, though I'm not sure how much help I'll be. You're the medical marvel in this family now." As they went through Ethan's notes, David couldn't help but reflect on the whirlwind of events that had followed Ethan's miraculous recovery. The story of the underground medical network had exploded into a national scandal, dominating headlines for weeks. Dr. Chun, Dr. Reeves, and several high-profile figures had been arrested and were now facing trial. The pharmaceutical industry had been shaken to its core, with new regulations and oversight measures being implemented at a rapid pace. Dr. Lindholm had become a leading voice in the push for ethical medical research, testifying before Congress and spearheading initiatives to make cutting-edge treatments more accessible to those in need. As for David and Ethan, they had found themselves thrust into the spotlight as the human face of the controversy. It hadn't been easy. There had been countless interviews, legal depositions, and even threats from those who saw them as a threat to the status quo. But through it all, they had each other and the unwavering support of Dr. Lindholm and a growing community of advocates for patient rights and ethical medicine. A knock at the door interrupted their study session. David opened it to find Sam, his journalist friend, standing on the porch with a wide grin. "Hey, David," Sam said, waving a newspaper. "Have you seen this? They're calling it a landmark decision." David scanned the headline, "FDA approves groundbreaking treatment for autoimmune disorders, inspired by Thompson case." "Is that?" David began, his voice thick with emotion. Sam nodded. "Yep, the treatment that saved Ethan. Dr. Lindholm and her team did it. It's going to be available to patients nationwide." Ethan joined them at the door, his eyes widening as he read the headline. "Dad, do you know what this means? All those kids I met in the support group, they might have a real chance now." David pulled his son into a tight embrace, feeling a complex mix of joy, relief, and a tinge of sadness for the difficult journey that had led them to this moment. Later that evening, as Ethan chatted excitedly on the phone with his friends about the news, David sat on the back porch, lost in thought. The sound of a car pulling up roused him from his reverie. It was Dr. Lindholm. "I thought you might have seen the news," she said, joining him on the porch swing. "I wanted to thank you in person. None of this would have been possible without you and Ethan." David shook his head. "We just did what any parent and child would do in our situation. You're the real hero here, Sarah." Dr. Lindholm smiled softly. "Maybe we all played our part. The important thing is that we've opened the door for real change. Ethical research, transparent practices, putting patients first. It's a new era in medicine." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun set over the neighborhood. "You know," David said finally, "when this all started, I was just a desperate father trying to save his son. I never imagined we'd end up changing the whole system." Dr. Lindholm nodded. "That's often how the biggest changes happen. One person refuses to accept the status quo, and it sets off a chain reaction." As the evening deepened, David reflected on the incredible journey they had been through. The fear, the desperate choices, the ethical dilemmas. It had all led to this moment of hope and possibility. Ethan joined them on the porch, his face alight with excitement about the future. As David looked at his son healthy, happy, and full of potential, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had faced unimaginable challenges, confronted powerful adversaries, and navigated a complex web of ethical quandaries. But through it all, the bond between father and son had only grown stronger. Their experience had not only saved Ethan's life, but had also paved the way for countless others to receive the care they desperately needed. As the stars began to twinkle in the twilight sky, David Thompson realized that their ordeal had taught him the most valuable lesson of all, that a parent's love, combined with unwavering determination and a commitment to doing what's right, could indeed change the world. The road ahead would still have its challenges. There would be ongoing legal battles, continued advocacy work, and the day-to-day reality of managing Ethan's health. But now, they faced it all with a renewed sense of purpose and the knowledge that their struggle had meant something greater than themselves. As the Thompson family and Dr. Lindholm sat together on that porch, they weren't just celebrating a medical breakthrough or a personal victory. They were witnessing the dawn of a new era in healthcare, one built on ethics, compassion, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to give up hope. In the end, what had started as one father's desperate quest to save his son had blossomed into a movement that would touch countless lives. And for David Thompson, that was the greatest cure of all. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.